They said that in medieval Italy, a family's security could be measured long before winter arrived, not in coin or land or titles, but in cheese. Not the cheese they traded, the cheese they kept. Across the hills of Lombardy and the crowded streets of Bologna, cooks shaped small dumplings for the year's leanest months. Not with potatoes, Europe had never seen one. Not with rich wheat, harvests failed too often for that. They used what endured when everything else spoiled. They used cheese beaten into dough. It was gnocchi in its oldest form, heavy, simple, stubborn. A food built not for pleasure, but for certainty in a world where certainty was rare. Because in the 14th century, famine did not arrive with warning. One cold spring, one wet harvest, and entire regions tightened their belts until the next year's hope. So medieval cooks trusted what they could store. Butter turned sour. Meat rotted fast. But cheese, salted, aged, hardened against time, could wait out a season's failure. And for generations the dumpling survived exactly as it began. A small, dense reassurance in boiling water. Then came a new crop from across the ocean, one that could have changed the dish entirely. Softer, cheaper, easier to grow than grain. A crop that would one day define the gnocchi we know. But Italy refused it. Not for a decade, not for a lifetime, for more than 150 years. Most countries embraced the potato as salvation. Medieval Italy saw something else. A threat to the logic that had kept its people alive. Medieval Europe was not a continent of abundance. It was a continent of volatility. One year's grain might fill granaries to the rafters. The next might yield only disappointment. Floods drowned fields. Frost blackened crops overnight. And in an age before crop science or global trade, a failed harvest was not an inconvenience. It was a threat. So medieval kitchens adopted a simple rule: trust only what outlasts disaster. Cheese was one of those anchors. It condensed months of pasture into a single wheel, dense with fat, protein, and calories. Salted properly, a wheel of hard cheese could wait through winter and still feed a family in spring. And unlike grain, it didn't mold in damp years or attract the rodents that haunted storage rooms. Gnocchi emerged from this caution. It wasn't a dish meant to impress. It was a dish built from what could be counted on when the world shrank to whatever was on the shelf. The earliest recipes, preserved in 14th century manuscripts from Bologna, described gnocchi made from fresh cheese, flour, and yolks, mixed in the manner of migliaccio. Migliaccio itself was a humble flatbread. Cheese and grain pounded together, fried in a pan, and eaten warm. Gnocchi followed the same logic. Small dumplings, shaped on a wooden board, boiled just long enough to hold together, about the size of a walnut. Not for beauty, but because smaller pieces cooked faster and wasted less fuel. And the dish spread, not because it was luxurious, but because it was dependable. Families knew exactly what it gave them. A meal when the cellar was empty, strength when the year ran thin, certainty in a life that offered little of it. In medieval Italy, gnocchi was not a comfort food. It was a survival strategy. A 14th century cookbook rarely gives detail for pleasure. It gives detail for survival. So when the manuscript from Bologna instructs the cook to mix cheese and flour in the manner of migliaccio, it's not referencing technique. It's referencing logic. Migliaccio was a food designed to stretch. Cheese and grain combined into a dense flatbread that filled the stomach and delivered energy slowly. It was quick, cheap, and efficient. 3 words any medieval kitchen lived by. Gnocchi, in its earliest form, belonged to the same family of foods, dense, durable, predictable, and every part of the recipe reflects the pressures of its age. Fresh cheese meant local production, not market dependence. Flour grounded the dough just enough to shape it. Egg yolk added richness only when available, a seasonal gift. Walnut-sized pieces cooked fast in rolling water. Boiling, not frying or baking, saved precious fuel. But the most revealing detail is what the recipe does not contain: There is no instruction for water adjustment, no mention of moisture control, no comparison to potatoes or other starches. Why? Because Europe in the Middle Ages simply did not have potatoes. The tuber existed only in the Andes. It would not reach the continent until the 16th century. Which means this: gnocchi, as medieval Italy knew it, as generations counted on it, was shaped entirely in a world without the crop that would later reshape European diets. To understand why Italians resisted potatoes for 150 years, we must understand this first truth. Gnocchi did not begin as a pasta. It began as a preserved pasture, transformed into something that could keep a family alive through the precarious rhythm of the medieval year. And when a new food threatened that logic, fear, not curiosity, became the stronger instinct. Before the 16th century, Mediterranean cuisine lived within strict limits. No tomatoes, no peppers, no corn, and most importantly for our story, no potatoes. The Columbian Exchange rewired Europe's table, but medieval Italy never saw that transformation. Its cooks operated within a closed universe of wheat, barley, cheese, milk, beans, and whatever vegetables survived the local soil. The potato, when it finally arrived from the Andes, was unlike anything Europeans had tasted. It grew underground. It resisted cold. It delivered calories in amounts that could sustain families through winters previously endured with dread. In Germany and the Low Countries, farmers adopted it rapidly. Historians note that in regions prone to famine, the potato became a shield, a crop that did not fail easily. But in Italy, reactions were different. In cities like Venice, Naples, Florence, and Bologna, the potato was not welcomed as salvation. It was regarded with suspicion. Botanists wrote that its leaves resembled the nightshade family, plants associated with poison. Farmers distrusted a crop that grew hidden beneath the soil, and in a culture where wheat had long shaped identity, bread, ritual, and taxation, the potato seemed an intruder. Even when botanists pleaded for its adoption, most Italians held back. To them, a root that grew in darkness did not seem like a fitting replacement for the grains and cheeses that had supported life for centuries. And so, medieval habits persisted into the early modern world. Gnocchi remained what it had always been: cheese held together by flour. The potato, waiting in baskets at the edges of markets, remained unwanted. Italy had not yet learned what famine would one day teach it. Recipes evolve, but rarely without resistance. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Italian cooks finally began experimenting with gnocchi variations, not with potatoes, but with new combinations of cheese, breadcrumbs, and dough. Bartolomeo Scappi, chef to two popes, wrote one of the earliest Renaissance recipes. His gnocchi were still cheese-based, but topped with cinnamon, sugar, butter, or pepper, a reminder that medieval and early modern palates did not divide sweet and savory the way we do. Yet, even in Scappi's kitchens, the most influential in Italy, the potato was absent. Antonio Latini, steward to the Spanish Viceroy of Naples, pushed the dish further. One of his versions blended marzipan cake, egg yolks, and cinnamon into dumplings that resembled dessert more than anything we'd now call pasta. Vincenzo Corrado, a century later, experimented with fillings: truffles, pheasant, spinach, even calf brains. His gnocchi were complex, aristocratic, and ambitious, but still missing the one ingredient that would later define the dish: potatoes. Why? Because even as cooks played with luxury, they remained children of a system built in scarcity. And in that system, innovation followed rules. Cheese was trusted. Grain was respected. Roots from across the ocean were tolerated at best. Gnocchi could be flavored, enriched, reshaped, but its foundation stayed the same. It was only when disaster struck, when harvests failed again as they had failed in the Middle Ages, that Italy would begin to reconsider a crop it had long ignored. Sometimes cuisines change because of inspiration, but more often they change because of hunger. and hunger was coming. The 18th century brought a familiar terror back to Europe: the collapse of grain harvests, blistering summers, frozen winters, flooded fields. A cycle Italians had not seen since medieval times returned with brutal rhythm. Bread shortages swept through major cities. Riots erupted around bakeries. Millers guarded their stores behind barred doors. And in places like Bologna and Tuscany, grain became a volatile currency again, measured, rationed, and fought over. It was in this climate, not in a kitchen, that the potato finally earned attention. Agronomists wrote desperate tracts urging farmers to plant it. One Bolognese writer in 1773 begged landowners to oblige their tenants to grow potatoes for the region's survival. The logic was simple. Potatoes did not fail the way wheat did. They resisted frost. They hid underground from rain and pests, and a single field could produce enough calories to carry families through seasons that would once have spelled famine. But the shift was slow. It was not culinary curiosity that changed Italian hearts. It was necessity. And as the 18th century unfolded, the potato crept into Italian kitchens not through the front door of preference, but through the back door of desperation. Only then did cooks begin adapting old recipes. Only then did gnocchi, once a dumpling held together by cheese, begin to share space with a crop Europe had once ignored. And even then, it was uneven. In some regions, cheese-based gnocchi persisted for decades. In others, potato gnocchi gained momentum only after wars, droughts, and shortages made resistance impractical. Gnocchi did not evolve because Italy desired change. It evolved because famine demanded it. Vincenzo Corrado, once known for stuffing gnocchi with truffles and pheasant, would be the first to record a potato-based version in 1798, but it did not look like the modern dish. His dumplings combined boiled potatoes with ricotta, egg yolks, veal fat, and spices. They were denser, richer, and far less uniform than the soft pillows we expect today. They were gnocchi rewritten under pressure. Corrado himself understood the significance. In a treatise devoted entirely to the potato, he urged cooks to embrace the tuber not because of fashion, but because it could prevent starvation. Other chefs followed. Throughout the early 19th century, cookbooks from Genoa to Naples offered new formulas: more potato, less cheese, more starch, fewer eggs, simpler, cheaper, easier to prepare in bulk. By 1863, a Genoese cookbook finally recorded the modern structure: potatoes plus flour, nothing else. A dough that could be rolled, cut, and shaped in minutes. The cheese-based ancestor did not disappear entirely. It remains in pockets of northern Italy even today. But the center of gravity had shifted. Gnocchi had crossed a boundary. It was no longer a dumpling built from the logic of medieval scarcity. It was now a dish shaped by a post-famine world that trusted a crop once viewed with fear. And in that transition lies the answer to the mystery. Italy did not reject potatoes because they were unfamiliar. It rejected them because its culinary identity was built on centuries of caution, an identity formed long before the Andes sent a route across the ocean. To understand why potatoes were refused, we must understand what gnocchi once meant. The modern diner knows gnocchi as comfort, soft, warm, yielding, but its medieval ancestor belonged to a harsher world, a world where food was not judged by tenderness but by trust, a world where ingredients were chosen not for delight but for reliability. Cheese-based gnocchi survived for centuries because it answered the only question medieval families cared about: will this endure? When potatoes arrived, they answered a different question: will this prevent famine? It took generations for Italians to respect that answer. Tradition held tight. Identity resisted change. And in a culture that had survived famine on its own terms, surrendering to a foreign route felt like relinquishing the very logic that kept households alive. The eventual shift, from cheese to potato, did not erase the medieval dish. It simply layered new meaning onto an old one, Cheese gnocchi had been a food of discipline. Potato gnocchi became a food of adaptation. Both belong to Italy's past. Both tell the story of a cuisine forged between abundance and fear. And when we look at gnocchi today, soft, uniform, showered in grated cheese, we rarely see the centuries beneath it, the stubbornness of medieval kitchens, the suspicion of early farmers, the desperation of 18th-century grain failures, and the slow, reluctant acceptance of a crop once feared. History is not erased when a recipe changes. It lingers. In every bite of gnocchi, there are traces of a world that trusted cheese through famine, refused potatoes in caution, and finally, only when hunger pressed hardest, allowed tradition to bend. Today, gnocchi is simple, a weeknight meal, a dish made in minutes. But its past was anything but simple. It carries the memory of medieval hearths where cheese was rationed like currency, of Renaissance kitchens experimenting with luxury, of markets where potatoes sat untouched at the edge of suspicion, of centuries when taste bowed to fear. Italy did not reject the potato out of ignorance. It rejected it because food is never just food. It is habit, identity, inheritance. For medieval Italy, cheese-based gnocchi was a thread woven through the uncertainties of the year. Potatoes were a thread from someplace else, a thread that did not yet belong. Only famine could tie the two together. And so the dish changed, not because Italians sought softness, but because history demanded resilience. When we eat gnocchi now, we taste neither fear nor scarcity. But both shaped the dish we know. Both determined what ingredients were trusted, which were resisted, and how long a culture held to its old logic before accepting a new one. Potato gnocchi became tradition. Cheese gnocchi became memory. But both were born from the same question, a question that guided every medieval kitchen. What will keep us alive when the year turns against us? And for a long time, the answer was simple. Cheese. Only cheese.